you for joining us again today for another episode of our POP's Power of Public Speaking podcast. We're here today with another guest host or guest for our season 2 of the podcast, Josh Hoops. And Josh, I'm just going to ask you if you'd like to introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, well, hello everyone. I am a professor at a liberal arts college in Kansas City, Missouri. I've taught public speaking for a number of years. I was a communication major in college, and when I graduated from college, I went into marketing and did that for a couple of years. And I had an opportunity to go and teach English in China for 2 years, and that's where I discovered a passion for teaching and a love and a joy of public speaking in particular. And so then I went back to grad school, and many years later, here I am.
Well, thank you for being on the episode today. I've just been blown away by the different backgrounds and expertise and just quality of all of the guests that we've had on the podcast, and you being one of those. So I really appreciate you being here with us today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thanks for all our listeners. We've had pretty good turnout as far as our season 2. We've got people from all different backgrounds. I know there's a lot of educators out there, but we have students listening as well, and also just general professionals and people that care about public speaking and what our motto is, the power of public speaking, and what that can mean. So with each of these episodes this season, we've looked at different ways that our guests have been able to utilize that power and help students realize that power. And today we're going to be talking with Josh about his use of service learning in the public speaking classroom. And in particular, it's an activity which involves a partnership with local middle schools in Kansas City there. And it helps students develop their capacity for audience analysis and adaptation. So we're going to ask Josh to talk to us a little bit about that today. I guess to get started here, maybe give us a little bit of a background on this and what prompted you to create this speech assignment.
Yeah, so kind of in lockstock with the whole theme of this podcast series, helping students to tap into the power of public speaking. I think for me and probably most public speaking instructors, we're always thinking about ways to innovate and to make our teaching more effective, to provide activities and assignments that are going to help best prepare them to be successful as public speakers. And I had taught public speaking for a number of years, and I had gotten to a point where I had become somewhat discontented with the way that I was teaching it. And the reason for that was, I began thinking a lot about in what world, in what context would an individual be asked or have an opportunity to give a speech on some random topic to a captive audience of their peers. And the thing is, you wouldn't really have that opportunity. And so I began to really wrestle with, was it possible for me to create a more quote unquote authentic experience where my students would be giving a real speech with a real topic to a quote unquote real audience? And so that's kind of what prompted the development of this particular activity.
Okay, awesome. You get caught up in the everyday of just teaching public speaking, and I feel like you don't always question, is this actually reality? Is this what people are actually going to face? So I appreciate the fact that you took that perspective on it and tried to make it applicable to the real world for your students. I guess maybe to help paint a picture of the assignment, could you walk us through the different components of how this is made up?
Yeah, so obviously the first step was to begin kind of making my way into the local community. And so I did a number of different things to develop these relationships. I just a very quick background on myself. I'm from Southern California, and I did my doctoral work at Washington State University, and so I kind of consider myself a West Coast boy. And so I was hired at this college in Kansas City, Missouri, and so I didn't really know many people. I didn't really have many relationships, and so it took a lot of work in that first year to kind of get myself out there, doing a lot of networking. I attended local Chamber of Commerce meetings, for example, and through this work I got connected with an administrator with the North Kansas City School District. And I began to share kind of my vision for public speaking with this administrator, and she kind of got excited about what I was wanting to achieve. And so she put me in touch with avid instructors at middle schools in her school district. And so for those listeners who may be in different parts of the country where you don't have avid, essentially the purpose of these classes, which are offered to 7th and 8th graders, is to prepare them to do well in high school so that they can successfully apply and thrive in college. Like, that's the whole purpose of the class. And so through these connections, I was able to craft in partnership with the school district as a whole, but then these individual instructors as well, where there are a couple of different parts to the assignment. So the first is, after we discuss audience analysis with the students, we then go and take a field trip to the middle school, where the whole purpose is to get to know them. And so my students will put together icebreakers to kind of help break down some of the barriers that might exist. It can be kind of intimidating, a college student coming into your class. You're a middle schooler, and so wanting to kind of do a couple just silly activities to kind of create some rapport between my students and the kids. And then out of that, it transitions into an opportunity where we'll break up into smaller groups, where my students will ask them questions about, what they know, what they like, what they are interested in learning more about college. And then they will come back to the campus, and throughout the rest of the semester, they'll use that information that they gleaned during the field trip to help them create, well-crafted, tailored presentations to the particular group of kids that they got to know and meet. And then the second part of the assignment is the kids at the middle school will then take a field trip to our campus, where they'll hear these presentations that have been especially crafted and targeted to them.
So middle schoolers, I know, so we're talking 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. Are they all in one grade? Do they go all over the three, or what age group does that typically? Because I know a 6th grader is way different than an 8th grader. It's kind of a transformational stage there. So where do you see most of the students being?
Yeah, that's a good question. It has varied over the years. I would say I don't think we've had any 6th graders during my time, over the past decade or so doing this activity. I would say most of them are either 7th or 8th graders, and on occasion it's been hybrid classes of both 7th and 8th graders. And yeah, that is a great segue into the whole purpose, or the objective of the activity, is to really train my students in audience analysis. And while they may have a tendency to lump the 7th and 8th graders together, like, oh, they're middle schoolers, they do have different experiences, interests, backgrounds, and it is a different dynamic being a 7th grader in middle school than it is being an 8th grader in middle school.
Absolutely. So you mentioned objectives. So your main objective for your students is to be able to adapt to your audience and be able to apply this in the real world. What other objectives or learning outcomes come out of this assignment?
Yeah, the objectives are similar, I think, for any public speaking class, which is, to organize a speech well, right? To have transitions, have have an introduction that grabs the attention of their audience, to use vocal variety, to integrate visuals into their speech well. But then on top of that is this heightened aspect, which is to adapt all of that to this particular audience. So the particular introduction technique that they use is going to be specifically catered to the things that they learned about their audience, or the vocalics that they use is going to be kind of with that mindset of like, okay, this is who my audience is, so how do I need to use my voice to best to best appeal and to be effective and kind of winning them over, if you will. And so that's the main objective, is to take everything that they've learned, and the entire class is filtered through the lens of that particular field trip, and has really enriched the discussion that we have as a class, and has also enriched the level and the quality of the work of they're doing in their presentations.
So as far as results, other than being able to enrich the students, see higher quality of work, what other results have you seen, maybe even as opposed to not having this assignment, with students who have done this versus students who have not?
Yeah. So let me do a little bit of comparison and contrast, because I think it's a really important question. You know, prior to launching this assignment, what I found, you know, to me, audience analysis is one of, if not the most important skill that we develop in this particular class. And I found that audience analysis is often dismissed as, maybe in my experience with my students, was often dismissed as like not important, or maybe like as an obvious thing. And so they would engage in very simplistic, at best, or like stereotypical at worst, audience analysis. And what some of the things that you know, I found through this activity is an opportunity to kind of challenge their preconceptions, right? So the students will come in and I present this assignment, and they'll think like, well, I was a middle schooler 4 to 5 years ago. Like, I know what that experience was like. And so they kind of have this idea in their mind, like all middle schoolers are the same. And oftentimes when we talk about audience analysis, or when I ask my students to reflect on like, how did you adapt your speech to your particular audience, oftentimes the answer is something like, well, this speech I think is good for anyone, right? Anyone can get something from this, which there may be some truth to that, but I really want to push my students to think like, how best can you adapt your particular message to that audience? And I think anyone who has taught public speaking probably has gotten that response at some point, which is, well, I just think that this topic or this speech is good for anyone, right? There's kind of this universal audience that appeals to. So I thought it might be interesting for your listeners, Tyler, just to kind of share just some of the specific examples of what I'm kind of getting at here. So sometimes we visit a class and the student, the kids are very active. They're very energetic. They joke around with each other, and with my students as well. And then sometimes we go to visit a class and they're very quiet. They're very shy. They're very reticent. And you know, that's a very different audience dynamic. And so that poses a challenge for my students to think like, okay, how do I go about presenting this information to an audience that's really revved up, right? As opposed to like, how do I get this, how do I get my audience to engage with me when they're so quiet and reticent? And so that's been really fascinating to kind of explore that tangent with my students. And then sometimes, you know, they learn things about the kids that really surprise or shock them. You know, one of my students, she really wanted to do a whole thing on the Lion King, and she brought that up during the field trip, and then she realized like, oh, none of them know what the Lion King is, and so she had to really reverse course. Or, you know, another example, you know, one time we went to the school, and the only thing that the kids wanted to know about was was uh was, you know, the careers that make the most money. And so they're like, oh, okay. So they went and they did all of that research and they presented that to the kids. One year we went and one of my students interacted with some middle school kids who had been bullied quite a bit by others, by their peers and their classmates. And so she went back and she took this information and crafted a really interesting and compelling and supportive message for those kids that really needed to hear it. And then a lot of times they're really surprised at how much information that they already know about college. They'll come back from the field trip and they'll think to themselves like, wow, I didn't know any of this stuff when I was in middle school. Like I didn't know the questions to ask. And so when we go into the field trip, in their mind, they're thinking like, okay, I'm going to start at like level one, whatever level one is, in terms of the quality or depth of information that I'm going to present. And then when we leave the field trip, they're like, oh, I need to start at level four, right? Level one, two, and three, they already know that. And so I need to kind of up my game, so to speak, in terms of the information that I'm presenting to them. And so I think one of the things that I get most excited about this activity is seeing their creativity that comes out of it, right? So, sometimes the middle school kids ask questions like, do you have a curfew, right? Or they're surprised to learn things like that they're not in class from like 8 to 3 like they might be. And so this has led to, on a couple of different occasions, my students will create presentations about like the the benefit and the curse of freedom that you have in college, right? So on the one hand, that freedom allows you to explore your passions and things that you're interested in, but the curse of it is that it can lead to procrastination and you might engage in mismanagement of your time. And so those are some of the things as an example of one of the topics that students have come up with as a result of really trying to understand the interests and the background and the needs of their audience.
And I was thinking when you said that you've got middle schoolers who might be excited or shy, I guess if they were excited, you'd really have to strive hard to keep their attention. So you're not only catering to a certain audience as far as topic, but you have to cater to the audience and how you're presenting the information too, because I thought about you saying there's these sort of one size fits all topics, but I think people have to consider that how you deliver that to the different audiences could make all the difference, whether that particular audience is going to come away with what you think this universal message is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it poses an interesting challenge for speakers. That enthusiasm that the audience like that it brings to the speech event is something that should be cherished and embraced, but it also can go over the board where you can kind of lose control of the ship, if you will. And so how do you channel that energy in a way that doesn't get things off the tracks, if you will. And so, when you have a really energetic audience, right, I think there's an opportunity to bring up like volunteers, right? They get really excited, like they want to kind of show off for their classmates. And so you can kind of do some of those things. Whereas with the more quiet and shy group, like you don't want to put the spotlight on one or two students, right? Because they'll feel very uncomfortable, but you want to still involve and engage the entire audience. And so can you do activities or an exercise that everyone is involved in, as opposed to the more energetic group where you just bring up maybe one or two people, just as an example of something that you could do to adapt to those different audience dynamics.
And maybe you said this, but so I was listening to the different types of topics that come up in these speeches, and it sounds like a lot of them are derived from the conversation that was had on the field trip. But then I heard Lion King. So do they come, so the field trip stage is when they go to the middle school, and do they go with any sort of topics ready for that day, or is that just a presentation on, hey, we're here, we're from college, what questions, more of a Q&A to help learn about the audience?
Yeah, I mean, the whole purpose is to learn about their audience. What are they interested in? What questions do they have about college? What are their interests, right? This is the focus of the field trip. And it can be kind of a challenge, because, college students like to talk, and sometimes the middle school kids will ask questions and they'll want to answer it. And if it's a really quiet and shy group, my students will want to fill the gap. But really, I stress to them, like, the whole purpose is for you to learn about them. They'll have a chance to learn more about you when they come to our campus, but the whole purpose is to be really listening and learning rather than sharing and giving information.
So when the middle school students come onto the college campus, is that when the presentations are presented to them?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So do they are these group presentations or individual presentations? How many do they typically sit through?
Yes. So that's a good example of a meta conversation that we have with my students, which is, one of the ways that I adapt, or I'm going to adapt to this group of middle school kids, is I'm not going to ask them to sit through, 20, 25, 5-minute speeches. So instead, I break them up into groups of like 4 or 5. So that's typically how many speeches that the middle school kids will be asked to listen to.
Okay, that makes sense. I was just thinking through the logistical side of that, and I know how many speeches, like if you're going through a standard speech day in class, it could take 2 or 3 days, and I could see middle schoolers' interest kind of wane toward the the end of that.
Yes.
But groups make sense. That's a smaller group, and it probably helps keep attention a little better. And so, how do you go about, from an instructor perspective, scoring all of these groups? I guess they're going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll be in one room and taking my notes as usual, but then I will ask uh, students to film the other speeches, and so I can go back and grade them after the fact.
So they're all in their own rooms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. At first, I was picturing just this one big loud room of one person's in that corner, but so they do have an isolated experience where they can truly give a presentation, and they're not talking over the other group.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this, I mean, the whole experience as a whole, but I think this is another good example of this. The students really need and do kind of take ownership over the assignment because it is a more of an authentic experience than kind of the one that I was describing at the beginning of the podcast, which is, right, they have an opportunity to really make a difference in the lives of the kids that they're working with, right? These are kids who have questions, right? They're there, they want answers to their questions, and so they have an opportunity to really impact, right, the trajectory, and maybe in some small way, but because the experience is more authentic, I have found that they're more likely to take ownership and be more invested in the outcomes rather than just like, yeah, this is a speech that I need to get done for my class.
Absolutely. I think too often, I was just speaking with an instructor yesterday talking about how can they get their students to become engaged in the class, or they had a certain number even drop the class in the beginning, and they're like, how it seems like there's just a lackluster uh, just motivation around classes, especially since people have been on and off of campus. It's been online, things have been hectic, people have got many things going on in their lives, more than normal probably. Hopefully we're getting back to some normalcy soon, but and it's starting to already. But she was talking about, how can I get students excited? And I guess I sort of tried to give a recommendation, not to do this assignment, but in this vein of give them a sense of audience. And I tried to focus on the class there, but it seems like, especially when they see an external audience like these middle schoolers and have their message make an impact on them, that is a great way to make the class interactive. And I've always said of public speaking classes, you get out of the class what you put into it, and that can go either direction. You can get nothing out of the class and just get through it and mark down that you've checked that box for graduation, or it can be a life changer professionally and personally. And that's what I always say, and that's why me as an engineer, I'm now on this podcast today, and why I work with Pops and Pops Classroom. That's how all that started. It had a huge impact on me. So that's what's interesting about this assignment to me. It seems like a almost surefire way to get the students engaged in that way and make them care about the class.
Yeah, and I want to caveat one thing. Not all of my students will seize this opportunity, right? So as an example, sometimes students will be like, I'm going to speak about what it's like to be a student athlete. Oh, that's great. How many of the kids that you met with during the field trip are interested in sports? Like they play sports, they watch sports, and none of them. Well, then why are you choosing that as your topic? But I would say, in kind of affirming what you just said, Tyler, which is my percentages have gone up in my experience to how much that there is a lot more investment and engagement in the class because there is that authentic experience and that real audience attached to it.
I kind of mentioned a little bit about just changes in the last year, and I know when we talked before, you said that you had suspended this assignment during COVID, and I just wanted to ask you your experience with that. Kind of, did you miss the assignment during COVID probably? And you said you'll be returning back to it soon, and I just wanted to kind of ask you your experience with that in the last year and your general experience as a public speaking educator during that period. A lot of our other guests and hosts on this season have touched on that, and I think it's definitely something that it almost feels cliche at this point, but I think each person has brought a new perspective and a good nugget of information. So I wanted to ask you about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of different parts to that question that you just asked. I mean, so the first part of your question, which was about, what are the plans for this particular assignment, and you are correct. We did have, or I did make the decision to suspend it. I mean, middle schools weren't allowing visitors onto their campus, and I also was very uncomfortable about continuing it during the pandemic, and probably for fall semester it won't be utilizing this particular assignment. I did miss it. It's one of the things that I am most. I mean, I enjoy teaching public speaking regardless of whether or not this assignment is included, but it definitely is something that makes me most excited about returning to the class because whereas a lot of the public speaking theories that we go over in class are very similar from semester to semester, this assignment produces new outcomes every time we do it, right? Because the kids are different and my students are different. And so, yes, it definitely is something that I've missed. And right now the plan is to reintegrate this assignment next spring into the class curriculum. Yeah, in terms of the second part of your question, which is, how the pandemic, I think, impacted the way that, that I went about teaching this particular class, and just a little bit of a background for your listeners. I did teach public speaking in person this past year, and so everyone in the class was 6 feet apart, and were wearing masks. And I know a lot of public speaking instructors are quite adept at offering this particular instruction virtually. I was not one of them. I kind of struggled with that, and so I wanted to be in person as whatever that was going to look like. And yeah, I really had to rethink a lot of the activities. It's a very interactive class. I like to do things in small groups, and I like to pass out a lot of materials that we use. And so I really had to rethink a lot of the ways that we offered this particular class. But one of the things that I did was I tried to engage my students in a lot of meta discussion about the ways in which the pandemic was impacting their performance. And so some of the things are probably pretty predictable. Things like they had to project more, right, because the mask was stifling their projection, or the audience was so spread out, and so it made eye contact more difficult, or their facial expressions were suppressed because the audience couldn't see them. And so out of that, they tried to become they tried to compensate for that in other ways, right? So using more intentionality with their eye contact and their vocalics and their gestures, which was a really interesting development that I don't know if I had fully anticipated going into the semester. And it was, and as a secondary outcome, I think a lot of the students shared that they had become more resilient as a result of taking this class during the pandemic, right? So, they realized that things that they might have taken for granted, right? Like practicing their vocalics beforehand, they realized they couldn't do that. So, before coming into class, they were practicing in the dorm rooms with their masks on because they wanted to try to get the volume just right. And so that was something that was really interesting for me to hear the students kind of share about their experience taking this class during the pandemic.
Thanks for sharing that. It's been interesting to me, I guess, in the perspective that I have, that I talk with a lot of different instructors from across the country, and I see the different ways that people handled the pandemic and teaching during the pandemic. And I thought it was particularly interesting for public speaking educators to go through these hurdles, because in a way, how those as educators deal with this and go over these hurdles sort of lends to their credibility in the fact that public speaking, I think, you don't know always what scenario you're going to be in when you get out there in the real world. And as much as you try to prepare students for that in class, obviously this is an extreme example that we don't want to just have to go through all the time, but it was interesting because I think a lot of people did a great job, more so than maybe a math professor. I don't know. I'm just throwing something else out there, something more regimented. But this is very much a living skill. I think that it's been interesting to watch how people have dealt with that, and it's almost been like a crash course in dealing with the unexpected for the last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It I think has cultivated for everyone, not just students, but faculty, people in their different professions. It has cultivated adaptability, which is an important skill. And, in terms of public speaking, right, you can never fully control the variables on the ground when you are in a new space, right? I remember when I was doing my interview presentation for my school, I was right in the middle of my research presentation, and all of a sudden, the PowerPoint had been hijacked by a different room, and obviously not as severe as the pandemic precautions, of course, but it certainly required me to really adjust on the fly. And I think the students, after a point, I mean, yes, certainly there was some frustration about having, all of the different protocols at times, but I was really I was really overwhelmed by their capacity to kind of take it in stride, to adapt to those different circumstances, and then also find new pathways to thrive in a very unpredictable under very unpredictable circumstances.
I've wondered, could just ask your opinion on this. Do you think that potentially students, as they've had to wear masks, maybe during speeches in the last year, potentially has even been a positive as far as helping with some students' anxiety? They kind of have a barrier between them and the audience. And not that that's a good thing, because I think you probably need to learn to get over that. But do you think that probably has taken place in the last year?
Yeah, I think it was probably it's I'm reluctant to quantify my answer here, but it felt a little bit in those conversations that was about 50-50. So half the class, I felt like they shared that their their personalities or their quote unquote true selves were kind of being suppressed, that the audience didn't really get to know them, right? Because and they weren't really able to display the pathos, right? The emotion that they would have wanted to during their speeches, or their passion for their subjects, because they felt kind of handcuffed, if you will. But then the other half of the class, and this was something that I did not predict going into the class. So it's an astute observation that you're making, which is they felt that some of that anxiety was alleviated through the social distancing precautions, through the wearing of the mask, because for some students who have moderate to high CA, right, giving a speech can be a very vulnerable thing, right? You can feel very exposed, right? That people are judging you, like that's you on display for the audience to evaluate and to analyze. I mean, we know that audiences don't usually engage in that kind of critical scrutiny that we kind of conjure up in our own minds, but they did feel a sense of like more comfort and confidence because they felt there was that buffer to some extent that was created by wearing a mask and the social distancing.
Okay. Well, thanks for going over that. I didn't mean to take us too far off course on pandemic discussion, but I was interested on your take on those things, and I I guess I want to go back to your assignment, and in the sense that we've talked about all the different perspectives of audience and knowing your audience and knowing who's the audience is of this podcast, a broad group from different backgrounds. For someone who does not teach public speaking, or maybe is not a student or is a student, all the different backgrounds that we have listening, what can they take away from this assignment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am a big advocate for the skill set of audience analysis and not superficial or stereotypical audience analysis, but really trying to understand the ways in which the demographic diversity, in terms of the interests, in terms of the language that's employed by different groups, to really understand where they're at so that the message can be best presented to them, right? And whatever the field is, I mean, you mentioned engineering just a few minutes ago, but whether you're in business or you're in the medical profession, or whether you're just simply interacting with a family member or a significant other, really trying to listen and to try to understand. So there's really an onus on the speaker to get outside of that mindset of like, I'm the one dispensing information to my audience, but trying to understand the needs and the interests of the one that they're communicating to, and then allowing that to impact in substantive ways how they go about presenting the information. And it doesn't mean that you change the overall goals or objectives of what you're trying to achieve, whether it's to entertain, whether it's to inform or to persuade, but it will lead to a higher level of efficacy in achieving your goals when you've taken into account their perspective, right? So really trying to understand the speech event is kind of this back and forth, this give and take, this relational development, rather than I am the speaker and I'm going to share with you what I want to share to you.
For me personally, when you're, say, creating a preparation outline, it's like it's taking it from that stage to where I'm writing down information, almost writing a paper, to when you're delivering it, it's almost like you're having a conversation with someone who doesn't speak back, and to more than one person. You got to have that dynamic to get that information across to those people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the speech does not exist in a vacuum, right? It's always in relationship to the ones that you are speaking to.
Absolutely. Well, if someone doesn't take anything else away from this episode, I think that would be a very important takeaway. And with that, is there anything else that you'd like to leave with our audience before we wrap things up today?
Yeah, no, not really. I just want to say thank you for inviting me to participate in this podcast, and I hope everyone is doing well and keeping safe, and hopefully we can see a end to, kind of a light at the end of the tunnel, if you will, in regards to this pandemic.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, Josh. Again, we were speaking today with Josh Hoops, and I'm Tyler Poteet with Power of Public Speaking. And thank you again for listening to our Power of Public Speaking Pops podcast. You can find all the episodes, including this one, on our website at powerofpublicspeaking.com. They're also available via SoundCloud, which distributes out through the RSS feed, through Apple Podcasts, I think Google Podcasts, many of the major platforms. And it will also be available on YouTube, on our channel, on POP's community channel, and you can find all of these links from the website, where we will post this episode and post a blog post about it. So thanks again, Josh, and thanks to the audience. We look forward to you hearing us again in our next episode. Take care.